Greetings and welcome back to yet another episode of Afterbirth Plus modding tutorials, and in this one I'm gonna teach you how to actually add active items to the game. And in this one we're basically gonna take the same example I explained in one of my previous videos. You can find it in the description, or maybe you can Google Afterbirth Plus modding examples, and I explained this mod in detail there, but I'm just gonna go through it fast so you can maybe see what's going on. So first of all, we create a variable called hothead and we register the mod under the name hothead. We also supply the version number. This is important because every time the game updates, we basically have to increase this number or change it to whatever version is applicable. This is done so mods don't get outdated and maybe something breaks that shouldn't, and things like that. So you need to supply it. In our case, this is 1 at the time of this recording. Of course, when you're watching this maybe a month from now, this could be a very different number, something like 20 or maybe even more. That is very dependent on the developers, and I suppose they will supply us with the version number somehow. Then we create the actual items. So what happens is we have this XML file that contains the items in there, and we basically get the item ID by name, and we named our item Pyrokinesis. In the XML file, which I explained in my previous video, I tell you that there's max charges, what it says when you pick it up, and things like that. So basically this is our item variable. Here I have debug text, which is going to be useful for actually kind of showcasing what's going on in the room. In this one it's not very applicable because I don't really use it, but just know that whenever you're testing something, especially now that we don't really know what certain functions and variables do, it's very important for us to have a way to debug, and I think that's going to be much more visible in my next example. But for now, just ignore this line because it's not really used in this particular mod as of now. So the first thing we do is we get our player variable. So basically we say Isaac. Isaac is this global namespace object class thingy which has a bunch of functions in it, and by saying Isaac get player of 0, we're basically getting the first player. I think the 0 and 1 apply to you or the co-op maybe. I'm not really sure about that one again because the documentation doesn't really explain anything. But in this scenario, we're basically getting the player, so who we are in the game. So we're playing as Isaac, and we get the information about the player in our player variable. We also get all the entities in the room by saying Isaac.getRoom entities, and basically we get everything: the rocks, the doors, I think even us, all the enemies in the room, and things like that. And we'll try to basically apply burn to entities, and of course who will be applying them? Us as the player will. Then we go to the for loop to every entity that exists in the room, and we check if the entity of I, so of course we're looping through every single entity that's in the room, if that entity is a vulnerable enemy. A vulnerable enemy is basically any enemy that can be damaged by tears or basically just take damage, meaning that they are not invincible and that they can actually have the burn effect. Like there's no point in actually setting fire to the rock because obviously that can be done in this game. And if that particular enemy is a vulnerable enemy, then we basically apply a burn to them. The first parameter is who is applying the burn, so who is applying that burn in that particular moment, and that is us, the player. But we actually have to supply the reference to the entity, so we use this function entity reference. Again, this is one of those things that I'm not really sure why it works like this, and the documentation doesn't really explain it, but for the sake of the example, just imagine that you need to supply the reference to the entity and not the actual entity. We're basically saying this is the player that's dealing the damage to these enemies. The second parameter is the duration. I thought this was a seconds at first, but it seems to be in something else. It's not even in frame rates. I'm not really sure, but 24 seems to be about 1 second, so that's why that number is there. And that last number is how much damage it does. Again, I'm not sure if this is damage that's done per tick, or maybe the damage is done in total. Again, like I said, the documentation doesn't really explain anything, so for the sake of the example, this is just how it is now. So now that we created our mod, obviously we put it in our Afterbirth Plus mod folder, as I explained it in the previous video, and we'll go through the game and see just how this one works. Okay, so we're in the game now, and we want to see if our mod works. So what I did is I enabled the mod in our actual mods tab in the game, in the menu, and now that it's enabled, it apparently seems to be working. Now we have to actually get the item. And the way we can get it is, of course, with our debug console, and we can use the command give item. And then, of course, we know the item name, but not its ID, so we would write Pyrokinesis. And remember, because it starts with a P, it has to be in a capital letter, or alternatively, what you can write is just C511. Okay, now great, we got the item. You can see that the active item is applied here. It has 4 charges. It obviously uses the sprite that we used by Hothead that was provided to us by the creators. And the thing we can do with this particular item is we can also say debug 8, which gives us infinite item charges. That means that we can basically use this item every single time, and basically it can't run out of charges. And this is very good whenever you're testing, obviously, because it means that you don't have to pick up battery charges over and over again. So when you enter the room and press the spacebar item, we just burn everything, which is exactly how this item is supposed to work. And because, of course, we have infinite item charges, we can use the item indefinitely. So it seems to be working at this point. But you're saying, okay, but maybe the burn duration isn't long enough. Is there some way to alter that without maybe exiting the game and going back and maybe changing things? And of course there is. Let's go back to the code. I'm going to show you how to do that. Okay, we're back in the code now, and then now maybe we want to make some alterations or changes to the item. Let's say that we want to increase the duration of the actual burn, and we can change that by actually changing the second parameter, 24, to something bigger. Let's just change it to 100, which means that it should take about 4 times as long as the previous burn duration, and we'll see how that reflects in the game. So let's go back to the game. I'm going to show you how to actually reload the mod without closing and then opening the game again. Okay, we're back in the game now, and we have changed the code, but the game doesn't realize that we have changed the code. In order to actually apply the changes to the code, we either have to restart the game, or even better, what we do is we use the Luamod command and say Luamod Hothead, and when we say that, the game actually reloads the mod that is in there, and of course recompiles the code, and now theoretically the duration of the fire should be 4 times as long. And of course when we set fire to the enemies, you can see that the fire is substantially longer and of course also deals more damage. So this is just a nice way in which you can actually use the commands to change code in dynamically, meaning that you don't have to restart the game over and over again to actually see if things are different. With that said, this is our first example, which was provided to us by the mods, by the lovely developers, and the second example is something I conjure up myself with the help of the documentation, so I'll see you just in a sec. Okay, so we looked at our first example, and our second example is basically the same mod, just remade, which means that we use the same file structure, the same sprite, and basically the same code as well. The only thing that's different is the actual function name and what this mod does. So what this mod does is basically whenever you use your spacebar item, it sends you or it dashes you in the direction you're currently traveling, which means that it kind of adds a dash to it. Something that you can also add to this mod is maybe you can play an animation when you go, maybe a fart animation, or maybe you can make Isaac invincible. I would love to do that, but at the time of the recording I really can't make sense of the documentation, so I wasn't really able to kind of play enough with it to add those certain things, but I'm going to show you the documentation and how maybe you can decipher this thing for yourself. The point of this tutorial really is that just to show you how to add active items. Okay, so it's basically the same as before. So the first thing we do is we create a new mod called ExplodeHead. We register it with a 1 because that's the current version of the game. We create a new ExplodeHead item, we get the item ID by name. Of course, I still use the same file size, which means that the name of the actual item is Pyrokinesis and not ExplodeHead, because I don't really want to change too much, just to showcase that such differences can be made quite easily without actually having to go through and just changing every single file that you have inside of the game. So the actual code of the mod, what it does, whenever you use your active item, is you get, first of all, we get ourselves again. So we get our Isaac reference or our player reference, so we know who we are, so we can actually read our stats. And what we do is we actually just add the velocity. We use the function called add velocity, and we add the velocity to ourselves, and what we do basically is just multiply whatever velocity we had by 4, which means that in whatever direction we're traveling, we're going to be traveling 4 times as fast in that particular direction whenever we use our spacebar item. Of course, that is just very basic, but what I wanted to showcase in this particular mod is our makeshift debug tools in a way that just kind of show you how velocity changes with time. So what I do is I also have another function called debug text, and what this debug text does in particular, first of all, again, we get the player reference, we save it in a variable, and what we do is just we render that text on the screen with the player's velocity x and the player's velocity y, and again with the same stats as before. On the position x 100, y 100, and then red is 255, green and blue are 0, and our alpha channel is 255, which means that this is fully opaque, and of course seen if this was 0 then the text would be invisible. And of course we add the callback like before for the active item, but we also add another callback, so this is like 2 callbacks in one, for the second function. And basically we call this debug text function like we did with my example from my previous video. In this callback is called MC post render, which means that we call this function every single frame, and that is just going to showcase our position or our velocity in that particular scenario. So let's get into the game, and I'm going to show you how this works. Welcome to the game, and you can see some numbers on the screen now, and that's basically due to our debug text. So basically this is showcasing our velocity, our x and y velocity. So obviously if we just travel in one direction, only one of our velocities is going to change, and if we travel in the other one is going to change accordingly. Of course, if you just move in a diagonal, both of these velocities are going to change depending on how fast we're going. But okay, let's see if our item works. So let's give ourselves an item called Pyrokinesis. Of course, it's the same item as before because I didn't change anything but the actual logic of the item. Let's also give ourselves debug 8, so we have infinite item charges. So whenever we use this item, basically what happens is that we just dash in that direction that we're going. So of course you can see that this works well, and it showcases our velocity as well, so you can see how that changes. But what I wanted to show you with this particular item combination is how you can actually use the print text in order to debug something, or maybe to get a better insight into how something works. Again, like I said, this is a very simple example in the sense that it isn't really advanced, but I just wanted to put something out there to showcase how you can get started. Of course, we could also add a lot of animations here, dashing animations. We can make ourselves invincible so that during the dash we actually can get hurt. You know, that would make a lot of sense. But basically, whatever I've decoded from the documentation manual to this point, I've actually shared with you, and I wanted to show you the documentation manual just to maybe give you a guide of how to read it, and maybe you'll get a few ideas yourself, so maybe you can just experiment with it, and that way you can do something with it. So let's jump over to the documentation manual, and then we're gonna wrap this up. Welcome to Afterbirth Plus Lua reference guide, which is here to kind of tell us which functions exist in the game, what we can use. Sadly, it doesn't have anything described implicitly to us, which means that we can kind of have to experiment and figure things on our own. I expect this to get updated over the time, and hopefully with that, things will get a lot clearer. And that's also the reason why the first 2 videos are a bit lackluster, at least in content. They don't really have any severe mods, you know, they're more as a quick way to get started, but you know, you can't really expect much because the game has only been out for less than 24 hours, and I'm really kind of pushing these videos in hopes that I would get, or maybe motivate some of you to go and explore and maybe do things, or maybe try things and experiment with them and just, you know, figure out things for yourself, because it's like I said, it's a bit frustrating not knowing what lies in the documentation, what certain functions do. It's also quite a bit of fun to actually just experiment and see what crazy things you can conjure up. So the first thing you see is the debug console primer, and this is basically just a few debug tools, the console that exists in the game, how to actually enable it, which functions it has, which commands it has, and things like that. It's not very complete, it just gives you a few examples, but it's still a nice way to get started. This is basically what I've been using throughout the videos, by changing stages, by giving myself certain items, by spawning enemies, etc. You know, you can do that throughout the console, and that's very useful, obviously, whenever you're testing your mods. So the first thing that's kind of important here is the enumerations, and enumerations are a nice way for us to interact with the actual Lua API. So we basically have a lot of things in the game. You have the enemies, obviously every enemy has to have a unique value of some sort. We have ourselves, we have rocks, we have just a bunch of things. And we can't really remember the particular IDs of those items. So let's say that we have the entity leech, and an entity leech is obviously an enemy, which is also a leech, which deals damage to us. And obviously we are also an entity, but we are entity player, and you don't have to remember the particular IDs or numbers in this scenario. What you have to know is just that the entity player references to the player, and that the entity leech references to the entity that is a leech. Basically, enumerations are there just to make our lives just a little bit easier, or maybe to give us a reference, so that you see a number 245, you know that that is a poop entity. And this doesn't just go for entities as in enemies or ourselves, it also goes for callbacks, and callbacks are something that I've explained, but at this point you can see that there are 11 callbacks, or 12 if you include the 0 as well. So whenever we use ourselves, whenever we use a card, whenever there's an update, whenever there's a render, whenever we use our item, basically whenever something happens in the game, we can actually use it as a callback. And in this case, I've shown you two so far. The MC post render, which means that every time something renders, and I've shown you the MC use item, which is whenever we use our active item. If I want to do something passively, a passive item, for example, I'm going to showcase that later on. But my first idea is what you could do is you could pick up an item and then you could use a function to check if you hold that item, and basically you would check that every render frame. And if you do have a certain item, then you could do something with it. That's a very crude way of doing it, in my opinion, because it's not very elegant in the sense that this item won't do something. It really depends on what the item does, because you can code it in a lot of different ways, but maybe just an idea to get out there. But like I said, the entity or the enumerations exist for basically everything in the game, for every coin, for every heart subtype, for every challenge in the game, for every bomb variant. You can find all of that here, and that's obviously a great as a reference, and this is something that's very much needed if you want to actually create something more complex. Then, of course, we have the functions and the random functions, and I'm not really gonna go into that too much, but what's even more important is that you have certain namespaces and classes, and what these basically namespaces, how can I put this in a very nice way? Just imagine that a namespace is like a way for us to interact the game in a grand way, in the sense this is a namespace contains something that is relevant to the whole game. And I'm not really explaining it well, but let me just give an example, okay? If you just go to the class list, for example, and you can see that there are a lot of classes in here. We have the entity class, and the entity class in this scenario is basically something that is a part of every object in the game. So we are an entity, an enemy is an entity, a rock is an entity. A namespace is more like functions which serve, or maybe a collection of functions which serve to help us create mods, in the sense, and they're not really tied to anything in the game in particular, but more like the game state, I guess, or maybe the game environment. That's maybe a good way to put it. But you don't really have to worry about it too much, because even I am kind of struggling with the exact definition here. But what's important is that you know that it exists, or maybe that there's a difference, at least to some degree. So, of course, the second thing that's more important, of course, the things that's most interesting to us are the actual classes and what we can do with each particular thing that exists in the game. And we can see that we have the entity class, and that's maybe the main class, the main class of every single entity. And you can see that the entity class has a bunch of subclasses which are dependent on who you are. So if you're a player, let's just open the entity player, which is an inherited class of the entity class. And I never explained what inheriting is, but basically what it means that the entity player is a subtype of the entity, which means that every functions that entity has, entity player also has, which means that if an entity has a function kill, and if that isn't really mentioned here, and I don't think it is, the entity player class also has a function kill. And an entity player is basically whenever you say Isaac.getPlayer, you get the entity player class back, and that particular class has all of these functions inside. You can add golden keys, you can add golden bombs, you can add keys, you can add bombs, you can try to use a key on a door, you can get max trinkets, how many trinkets you can hold, how many items you can hold, you can get which active item you have, you can just get a list of items that you carry, you can add a certain card to the game, etc. Obviously here that you see that you add a card, a particular card, again, you should refer to the enumerations here, because obviously what you could say, okay, add card 3, but you don't know what card 3 is. What you would do is you would go here and you would say, okay, add card Hierophant, and then the game would know that you're trying to add that particular card to the player. And like I said, there's a bunch of functions here. I don't want to go through all of them. And I kind of thought that maybe it would be a good idea, but when I saw just how many things they implemented, it was kind of mind-boggling, to say the least. And I'm really glad that we have all of this. And if you actually want to do and just explore with things, just go in the game, just take the code I've provided in the description, and then just, start using functions and items. Sure, it might not work, things might break, but that's part of the fun, just experiment, basically. You can get how many hearts you have, you can basically give certain items, you can animate certain things and things like that. I mean, it's like I said, it's very expensive, and I'm really glad that they made this. The only thing I miss is that there would be a sort of description somehow that would actually tell us what's going on. Let me just give an example of what I mean. I wish that there was an actual description. So let's say that, okay, we have get active charge, so that's good. So what get active charges means how many charges you have on your active item, but what exactly is a get active subcharge? You know, like that doesn't really make sense to me, especially if you don't play the game. So if you click that, I think there should be a description here. Like I said, there's probably just the reason that they were in a hurry. They just didn't have the time to fill all of this up. But you know, some of the functions aren't very self-explanatory like others are. So for that reason, you can't really do a lot of things with it. So this was just the entity player class. Obviously, there's a lot more classes. Let's just take the room class, for example, and we can also have just a bunch of functions here which are tied to the rooms, obviously, because the entities are tied to the entities and the room class is tied to the rooms. What you can do here is get the seed, you can get the room shape, you know, you have the L rooms, the square rooms, the small rooms, etc. You can destroy a certain grid, so you know, you maybe destroy a rock or something like that. Maybe you have an item that destroys a rock, and you know, you can use this function to do so. You can get a boss ID you're on the floor you're on. You can get the second boss ID, so maybe you can change the boss ID as well, or maybe you can maybe change every boss to bloat if you want to do so. You know, that there's a lot of options there. If you want to be really mean about it. And like I said, you know, there's just so many functions that really, some of them are self-explanatory, some of them aren't really, but if you just go through it and, you know, you go under classes, class list, you just have a bunch of classes here which all have functions that you can actually use in the game, and they're fun to use in my opinion. I've played about a few with them, and it's quite fun with some things you can actually do. I've tried to make like an item that makes random explosions around the room, but the explosion didn't deal damage, which was surprising, which means I'm not probably using the right function. I'm probably just playing the sound of the explosion and not actually giving an explosion, you know. But these are the things that you're gonna come up with, and like I said, with time I bet that things are gonna improve and there's gonna be a lot more documentation. I just wanted to give you maybe a rundown on how you can use this, and maybe how you can use these functions, or maybe how you can reference it and try to experiment with it in the actual game. So maybe it went on a bit too long, but you know, thank you for bearing with me if you did. So this covers this video, which explains how to add active items to the game. And while active items are nice and very fun and useful as well, I also wanted to give you an example of how to actually look at the reference manual, and just to kind of show you how expensive it is, so kind of how hard to read it is as well for me, because like I said, while I do have some experience in coding in general, and while it's not that hard to learn whenever you know something, a lot about modding is basically learning the API that they have provided with you, and at this point there's a lot of experimentation, you know, and I think that's to be expected. Like with anything that you're learning, there's a lot of experimentation, a lot of failure, etc. So when I actually have a much better idea of how to add some solid mods, so like I had an example how to add passive items, or maybe items that have a passive effect. I have an idea of how I would do that already, or it would work, but I'm just thinking that there's probably a more elegant way of doing that, just in order to maybe give you the best solution possible. But you know, for the active items, because they did provide us with an example, I imagine that's the best example that they have provided, so for that reason I decided to showcase it here, so maybe you can do a few active items yourself. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this one, guys, and I hope to see you next time.